Good? Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Siva. I'm responsible for the AppTx practice, or the application transformation practice of Pivotal across Asia Pacific and Japan. I'm the guy who's standing between you and a well-deserved tea break. So I'm conscious of time. I'll make sure I'll wrap up in about 25 minutes. There was a lot of requests for show of hands, so let me join that bandwagon. Quick show of hands, people who are involved in solutions architecture or high-level design. You don't have to have it as core, but involved is enough. How many do we have? Awesome. Okay, this is going to be a great session. For those of you who didn't raise your hands, hopefully in 20 minutes, you will be ready to do that as well, right? So the topic is to strangle or not to strangle, but essentially it's about talking about modernization strategies with large enterprises. So as a team, that's what application transformation does, working with Fortune 500 customers and their legacy monoliths, and modernizing and replatforming them onto Pivotal Cloud Foundry platforms. So that's the background from where we come from. And today I just want to talk about what the Strangler Fig application, the Strangler application, or the pattern is, when it could be used, and if you choose to use it, how can it be done, right? What is the best way to go about executing it? Familiar fruit, hopefully, to folks. This is the fig. Might be more familiar with the dried version of it, the dried fig. It is an interesting peculiarity in the plant kingdom. It has an interesting life cycle, especially the tree that bears this fruit. It starts off pretty much as a little sapling on top of a host tree whenever an animal drops a fig seed over there. And then it slowly starts shooting roots down towards the ground. And over a period of time, it reaches the ground and slowly pulls away all the nutrients from the soil that is meant for that tree that it started growing on. And before you know it, you have a beautiful tree standing here that bears fig trees. It's actually known as the Strangler fig tree. And when Martin Fowler saw this in Australia about 15 years ago, he said to himself, this host tree looks like a monolith, and your new application over a period of time replaces that monolith. And the next thing you know, you've got a nice new application in your tech stack. The cool thing is, notice those little gaps here. It almost looks as if it's loosely coupled services, right? That's the beauty of a modern app. That's the genesis behind the term Strangler. It was originally started off as a Strangler Fig application, as the new application, and then it's sort of morphed into Strangler app, Strangler pattern. The next thing you know, it's a verb, to strangle or not to strangle. So I'm not here to advocate violence. It's just a term that we use architecturally speaking. So in Pivotal, we'd like to describe it as you've got a portfolio of applications. Think of it as the highways department. You've got small roads, big roads, and you need to modernize an application. And this definition is very useful when we speak to business stakeholders who are not used to or experienced with legacy monolith transformation. And then we say, okay, if you were to modernize a highway, how would you go about it? And you're just not going to cut it off one day and cut over, big bang cutovers, right? We all know what happens when we try that. I'm sure you've read in the papers about the TSB Bank fiasco in Scotland. When they tried that, pulled all their accounts down, folks couldn't read balances, check if they were receiving credits, make transfers. It really brought the bank to its knees and heads rolled. So we know that a big bang transformation is going to be risky. So what's a good way to go about it? Well, start small. And that traffic light right there is your, LTM load balancer, if it's a web app, a proxy, or an API gateway, really. Anything that can route traffic between the old and the new, right? And as this app grows, you could choose to expand the scope of it and in parallel sort of switch off pieces of the old app until you've got a nice new shiny app in place that can take almost all or all of the traffic. We're going to discuss some details later, so it doesn't have to take all the traffic, but you get the picture, right? So this, in effect, is the Strangler pattern of modernization of legacy monoliths. A lot of you might know this, but I just thought it's better if we all have a shared understanding, regardless of our roles in the organizations that we work for. Right? So now that this is the Strangler application, how do we go about selecting applications that fit this pattern? Right? You might have a single app, and you might wonder, will this strangle well? Or you could have a portfolio of applications, and you go, which ones do I containerize? Which ones do I re-platform onto a platform as a service? Which ones can I refactor? And which ones do I need to rewrite and, because it's risky, rewrite using the Strangler pattern? Right? So this is the methodology we use with large enterprises with wide application portfolios, but it's also applicable to a single app. So I'll just focus on key elements of this process in the interest of time. So first thing, of course, is we take a portfolio of applications, and no surprises, sometimes even reports from the golden source of application inventories can be fairly suspect, for want of a better term. So we have to data cleanse that to ensure that we're looking at an actionable subset of applications, right? So that's pretty much the first filter, and then we have the set of candidates of applications that can be analyzed further. The first step we do is we typically hired by the CIO or the CTO. The first thing we do is request for interviews with business users. And they go, wait, don't you want to look at the code? Like, yeah, we'll look at the code in a bit. But first we would like to speak to the business users to assess the business value of the applications that we select. Now, there are enterprises which have like hundreds, sometimes even thousands of applications. Now, we couldn't possibly analyze them all in the typical 3 to 6 week time frame that we take to do this exercise. So we have to pick representative applications. What do I mean by representative? We all know there are architectural eras in large enterprises, right? So you could have a set of Kix COBOL apps from 30 years ago, a bunch of client server-based apps, and then it could have moved into old Java, now new Java. You could have some Python, Go apps built fairly recently. So we want to pick an app, or at least an app or two from each of these sort of architectural strata, for want of a better term. And then only for those representative apps do we want to do the analysis. Right? Assess the business value. And then, of course, this is something that you would all be comfortable with, assessing the tech feasibility from a 12-factor or a 15-factor standpoint. Right? Essentially, assessing how technically feasible it is to move to the cloud or to modernize in general. And then you start getting this classic scatter plot. You could have seen it in your Gartner quadrants, where essentially you're trying to split your application portfolio to see what you can do with each of these apps. But to be honest, it's a bit of oversimplification. Oversimplification rather, because we all know that there's more than one dimension, right? Tech seems to be like just this one little axis here, but there are organizational implications. For instance, skills availability. Right? You may not have people who understand the Kix COBOL code that was written 20 years ago, or you may not have people who need to work on the target tech stack, for instance, in case there's an enterprise architecture group. There could be a regional dimension. So we look at this as a flat two-dimensional sort of functional matrix when we split applications, but there's a regional application, regional landscape where you could have applications of pretty much the same code base, but in different instances in different countries. This morning, Abhishek from Citibank spoke about data onshoring requirements, right? So Indonesia, India, China, it's slowly growing. So if you were to just flip that architectural landscape, you might see that there are regional strategies that you can evolve as well, in addition to pure tech, and pure business value. Right? But ultimately, the objective is to get applications into that 4-quadrant sort of a scatter plot where we see what we can do with that set of applications when it comes to options. And what are our options, right? Our options are really, and some of these are here, right? In case the technical wellness is not great and the business value as well is a fairly commoditized piece within your application stack, a simple rehost would be more than enough. And in case it's a dying business area where you no longer need your application, it could even be retired, but most cases, it's more of a rehost play, right? Oops, excuse me. The other piece is, in case it's reasonably 12-factor compatible, but it's still low business value, then what do? Well, you could re-platform either a Kubernetes-based container as an application service type platform, or even onto a platform as a service type of a re-platforming, right? And depending on what you want to extract. In case the technical wellness is high, it's fairly recently written application, but needs to scale up because of the high business value, then definitely there's a little bit more of coding work required, right? So we just call it refactor. Right? What you end up with, as David just said recently, scary big applications that you're afraid to touch because of the sheer risk of change. And because of that fear and risk avoidance, frankly, you've built up a lot of tech debt, so much so that the tech wellness factor is not that high. So it's sitting in this lower quadrant, and the option is pretty much to rewrite. Right? And if you're going to rewrite, what are the options? Well, you could strangle, and there are some other patterns as well. I would like to introduce something called an app continuum. It's something that one of our pivots hosts. It's a thought process from Pivotal, and essentially talks about the spectrum within the rewrite space. Excuse me. What do I mean by that? In case an application is relatively contained, size-wise, there is an overhead when you strangle. And we'll come to that in a bit as we talk through how to strangle really. Is it worth taking that overhead? This is a simple cost-benefit analysis, right? And we as technologists need to give that input so informed decisions are being made. And where that complexity is fairly well contained, you could just do a big bang rewrite. Right? There's no need to strangle because it's not big enough. The critical mass is not there. On the other hand, if it is there, then you can absolutely strangle. Right? That is exactly what I'm trying to just say here, which is if there is significant business criticality, both in terms of the sort of traffic that it handles, sheer size of the legacy code base, user impact in case we get it wrong, classic case for strangling. You don't want to mess with a big monolith and stand in front of a senior executive explaining a risky strategy. Right? And the other thing is, if the application is old, it has built a lot of technology debt, and on top of the tech debt, you also have these little hidden business logic that's never documented either in the code or outside, where it becomes extremely difficult for us to rewrite an application with high fidelity. High fidelity from two dimensions. One is existing business logic that is still needed by the business. We all know a lot of code has logic that's not exactly being used, especially if it's old, right? And on top of that, logic that needs to be applied because of the changing business environment. So we could equate it to market risk, for want of a better term. Right? So, and this is articulated in our approach called App Continuum, but this is pretty much the summary where we look at these two critical factors on top of the tech wellness and business value high-level dimensions that I had mentioned earlier. And if it matches this, then we'd absolutely recommend that we strangle as opposed to do a big bang rewrite. Right? So this is more about, okay, this is what Strangler is. These are sort of use cases where we could strangle. How do we go about it? Right. Fine, we've selected an application. We've decided that we need to strangle. How exactly can we do it in that risk mitigated fashion, especially if documentation is not good? Right. So we have a particular methodology that I'd like to speak about over the next few minutes. Some of it is industry standard practices, some of it is our proprietary inventions, so to speak. And this we call the Swift way, which it's because it's reasonably quick. It's not as if a bunch of business analysts and architects go into a windowless room and step out of it after 3 months with a nice deck of designs. It's more of an iterative design process, which starts with defining goals. Very logical, but here we've riffed off Andy Grove of Intel. It's a 40-year-old process of just saying don't stick with qualitative goals alone. Try and do qualitative goals, but make sure that there are quantitative metrics attached to it so you can measure success, and you can also show what success looks like right at the beginning of the project. Right? So that is how we pretty much start any assignment here in Pivotal. Once we do that, we request time from the business stakeholders and bring in the appropriate subject matter experts from across different silos within that enterprise, within that domain area. I was trying to avoid using that term, and get them to give their collective expertise through this exercise that's called Evenstorming. We didn't invent it. It's the invention of Alberto Brandolini. It's becoming increasingly popular. It's a very powerful tool. It can be used far wider than for just software design to identify process bottlenecks, to identify even sometimes organizational bottlenecks. But in this instance, given that the focus for us is legacy app modernization, we use Evenstorming from a design, software design standpoint. Facilitation, of course, is important. The good news is the facilitator doesn't need to know the business area or the domain, right? But the overhead, so-called overhead, or a critical success factor is that we absolutely need the subject matter experts to be present in the room at the same time, because the technique really uses that collective subject matter expertise that's there that can be brought out with far more fidelity than if you were to have one-on-one interviews, which is more of the traditional mindset, right? So the key is more in getting subject matter experts to come out there and put in their processes. Simple tools, Sharpies, stickies, different colors, shapes, and you lay it out. All you need is a big wall and a good facilitator, and you lay out the process that is pertinent to that particular legacy monolith, right? With an appropriate context. It doesn't have to be super narrow, right? Now, if you go back to some of the criteria, we said that it needs to be huge and it needs to be complex. So obviously, this is going to get pretty intricate, right, this exercise, and there could be a bit of chaos in the room, but it's okay. Out of chaos, order emerges, right? And once we have that big picture, as you can see some of the lines, we can already start to see intuitively that there are flows that can be used to strangle, right? So this could be the design strangle where we say, yeah, this looks like a flow that we could start with, a thin slice that we can pick up and do a double click and deep dive into, right? And once we select that, how do we take it to the next level? The first thing is to do a deeper dive Evenstorm, have the story told by the relevant stakeholders, and then look for, again, I'll be careful with the words here, potential service candidates, right? So it's more of Potential service candidates, we're not using any other terms, but the grounding is still in domain-driven design, in case you're wondering, right? But the focus is more on practically what can be developed out of this sort of a business logic that we need to cover in the new system. It's a bit unreadable. It's on purpose. The blue stickies are potential service candidates. The lines you see between them are the interactions. We spoke about Spring Cloud Stream recently, right? Multiple ways you could interact between services, but those are some of the options. But at this point in time, no technology. There's no talk of React.js, Kafka, CQRS, nothing. This is still purely in the tech agnostic space, where we're thinking of, okay, if these were the potential service candidates, what would the interactions be between them and across the new potential new app and the external systems that are in the green boxes on the diagram. And then we articulate the types of interactions that are needed, and that will then result in technology decisions that can be taken. Another positive sort of outcome of this is you can also start thinking about tech decisions. And we had some excellent presentations, starting with Josh's usually enthusiastic presentation. So we've got choices coming up, and you can make informed decisions on which technology will fit in, because you know that the technology choice is going to meet a certain business demand that has been clearly understood with a shared understanding across multiple set of stakeholders, right? It's not purely within technology. It's a whole bunch of folks that were in the room for the Evenstorm, and Boris, as we call it, this notional architecture, will be able to opine on the technology choices that can be made. And we outline the potential artifacts for each of these services. So each blue sticky here translates into a fairly detailed overview of what are the APIs that could be part of this service, what are the high-level user stories, right? Still at a fairly high level. Any data considerations, any UIs needed, technology or any other risks that need to be highlighted or addressed during the development phase. Right? So I would call this, mapping it to a traditional process, the end of your notional design or your V0.5 design, if you will, right? And then we plunge into code. Just before me, David, Tamara, and Angie spoke about frequent releases, so spoke about pair programming, CI/CD, et cetera. So clearly, on the back of this overview, we just need to get down to cranking, working code out that's well tested, that's ready to be deployed frequently. Right? And this uses Pivotal's best practices, though depending on the amount of time we spend with enterprises, we'll have to toggle the dial between delivery and enablement of these best practices. But essentially, you get tested code that we absolutely would want to push to production as soon as possible, because we all know between staging and production there's a fairly wide gap, even though it looks very close. And the other key thing is to take care of the learnings from this process, especially since we spend a fairly short amount of time with our clients. At the end of the engagement, we want to leave some learnings behind that can be reused. I spoke earlier about the different sets of repeatable patterns that emerge. And when we strangle a monolith and we're building a new monolith, clearly there would be reusable how-to guides, we call it recipes in a cookbook, that can be left behind for the team that is going to continue to strangle and take the new app into that critical mass stage where they can retire the old app or leave the vestiges of the old app in place. So if you notice this diagram, I've got some stuff in between that goes beyond process, right? And that's something that I'd like to speak about for a bit, which is execution of this is fine, but it's tough to do it in isolation, in vacuum. let's say we start strangling an app, and then we discover that a new feature is needed or a fix is needed. And then we go through the release cycles that some of you were voting on a few minutes ago. And even if it's like 2-month release cycle for the next small release before you can take that new Strangler application to the next stage, it's going to take decades before we retire the legacy monolith, right? So clearly the methodology needs to be supported by the rest of the organization in a constructive cross-functional way. And that's where, of course, tools are great. We've all heard about DevOps as a culture, not just a bunch of tools and processes. But tools are necessary. They may not be sufficient, but they're absolutely necessary. So you need the appropriate tools in place that can help you do CI/CD. And you obviously need the appropriate processes, approved processes in place. No one wants to go rogue and against your change management guidelines. But still, if there's an approved process in play that facilitates this quick movement, that's absolutely necessary to support the Strangler pattern, right? Well, I'm from Pivotal. Needless to say, a platform is a huge help, especially a platform that allows the developer to focus on the business logic. It's already difficult trying to figure out what the logic is, working with the product owner, and bringing it to fruition. And on top of which, if you have to deal with a lot of overheads from a DevOps standpoint, that just bogs the development team down. So a platform that facilitates this sort of a quick iterative loop really helps the Strangler pattern. Right? Methodology, in addition to the Strangler pattern, we spoke about pair programming, test-driven development, as onerous as it is. It's super useful when you know that the code that's going to be pushed into production is the level of confidence is that much higher than if you were expecting some sort of a test leakage in a traditional testing harness, right? And ultimately, people matter. The biggest bottleneck we face in several of the transformational engagements that we've worked on across the world really is sometimes people. And this is where executive sponsorship helps, but the collective buy-in also helps big time to ensure that politics, hidden agendas, et cetera, don't derail an otherwise smooth process of taking a legacy app into a monolith, right? Into a modern application stack that's fairly scalable. Let's just put it that way. Right? So this is pretty much what I wanted to cover today. Just to summarize, we started off by saying this is what we'll do. This is always good to revisit to keep ourselves honest. We did talk about what the Strangler is, how the name came about, how it's a good risk-mitigated way to modernize your legacy monolith applications. It's a tool in your toolbox, right? Feel free to use it where it's applicable. And where is it applicable? When there is complexity, when there's a huge risk of change, and when there is a certain amount of critical mass that you need to bite off in chunks as opposed to swallow whole, right? And finally, we also spoke about how to go about executing the Strangler if an opportunity arises. And it starts with domain-driven design-based principles, starting with the business, what they want to achieve, with an Evenstorm exercise, selecting an appropriate slice, doing a deep dive into it, coming up with a notional architecture, then taking technology decisions and coding using best practices on good platforms and tools, so you're able to rinse and repeat this often and get that Strangler to grow in the right direction. So at some point in time, you can cut over a significant portion or even all of your legacy monolith. So that is pretty much the summary that I wanted to highlight. And thank you so much for your attention. And when you have time, please do check out some of these recommended viewing, reading pieces. They're all excellent links. I've tried to cram a lot of information. You'll get out of your way. Try to cram a lot of information into 20-odd minutes. But these are some of the recommended links to take your curiosity one level deeper, if you will. Especially the first link that talks of Swift method It's both an article, and I think a video will be in there as well, where my colleague Sean spoke about this for a good 45 minutes plus at the recent Explore DDD conference. So with that, folks, please do share your feedback. I know we don't have time for Q&A. I'll hang out at the tea break area. Feel free to come by and give me your feedback. And if you can't do that, feel free to drop me a line, either on LinkedIn or by email. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.